One simple question about basketball. That's all it was supposed to be. Instead, it turned into a headline that had nothing to do with basketball at all, and everything to do with more than a decade of bad blood between the President of the United States and the biggest star in the NBA. This is the story of the day Donald Trump was asked to settle the oldest debate in basketball, Michael Jordan or LeBron James, and instead of picking a favorite based on championships or stats, he brought up something far more explosive. He suggested LeBron James might be racist. Let's set the scene, because timing is everything in this story. It was Friday, July 24, 2026. Just hours earlier, the entire basketball world had been rocked by a stunning announcement. LeBron James, at 41 years old, had decided to leave the Los Angeles Lakers and sign with the Philadelphia 76ers, taking a steep pay cut in the process, all in pursuit of one more championship before his legendary career finally comes to a close. Sports networks everywhere were still buzzing about it. Analysts were breaking down the roster fit. Fans in Philadelphia were still trying to process the fact that one of the greatest players who has ever lived had chosen their city for what he called his very last decision. And then, in the middle of all that basketball excitement, a reporter walked into the Oval Office and asked President Trump a completely different kind of question. Fox News correspondent Peter Doocy brought up James's big move to Philadelphia, and then asked the president something that reporters have been asking basketball fans in bars and living rooms for years. Who is the greatest of all time? LeBron James or Michael Jordan? It's the kind of question that usually gets answered with talk about championship rings, MVP awards, statistics, eras of competition. It's the kind of debate that fuels sports talk radio and fills up comment sections every single day of the year. Most people answering it would reach for a stat line, a signature moment, a finals performance that changed how we see the game. Trump didn't go that direction at all. He started with Michael Jordan. He called him a friend, someone he plays golf with, someone he described as a genuinely good guy to be around. It's true that Trump and Jordan have crossed paths over the years, moving in some of the same wealthy, high-profile social circles, occasionally photographed together at golf courses and events. Jordan, for his part, has spent his entire adult life carefully avoiding political entanglements, a strategy that dates all the way back to his playing days. There's actually a famous piece of basketball history buried right there, one worth pausing on for a second, because it helps explain exactly who Michael Jordan has always tried to be in the public eye. Back in 1990, during a closely watched U.S. Senate race in North Carolina, Jordan's home state, he was asked to publicly endorse the Democratic candidate running against a long-serving incumbent. Jordan declined. And according to the story that has followed him for decades since, he explained his refusal with a now legendary line about how Republicans buy sneakers too. Years later, in the widely watched documentary chronicling his final championship season with the Chicago Bulls, Jordan looked back on that moment and admitted it had been made somewhat off the cuff, not some deeply calculated political stance, but a quick, guarded response from a young superstar who had already decided, very early in his career, that he wasn't interested in wading into political battles that could alienate half of his fan base. That's the version of Michael Jordan that Trump was praising in the Oval Office that day. Not a political ally exactly, but someone who had built his entire brand around staying above the fray, someone who had made an art form out of not taking sides. And then Trump turned to LeBron James, and the tone of the conversation shifted entirely. He said something that immediately made headlines around the world. He suggested that maybe LeBron was racist, and then, almost in the same breath, wondered aloud whether maybe James simply didn't like him personally. He said he wasn't sure which one it was. And then he added something that, in a strange way, felt like it explained his entire approach to answering the original question in the first place. He said he only likes people who like him back, and that's why, when forced to choose between the two, he would pick Michael Jordan every single time. Now, if you're hearing this for the first time, you might be wondering exactly what evidence or specific incident Trump was referring to when he floated the idea that LeBron James might be racist. And here's the honest answer. It wasn't entirely clear, even in the moment. There was no specific quote, no particular statement from James that Trump pointed to as proof. It was more of a passing accusation, tossed out almost as an aside, layered on top of what was really, underneath it all, a much simpler and much older grievance. LeBron James has never been shy about criticizing Donald Trump, going all the way back to Trump's very first term in the White House. To really understand this moment, you have to rewind the clock nearly a decade, because this wasn't the first time these two very famous, very public men had clashed. Go back to September of 2017. LeBron James, then still playing for the Cleveland Cavaliers, publicly and bluntly criticized Trump on social media, using some fairly harsh language to describe his feelings about the president at the time. It was part of a much larger wave of athletes across multiple sports speaking out during that period, a moment when questions about kneeling during the national anthem, political division, and athlete activism were dominating the news cycle nearly every single week. Then came 2018, and things escalated even further. LeBron sat down for an interview with CNN anchor Don Lemon, and during that conversation, he described Trump as someone who uses sports to divide the country rather than unite it. Trump didn't let that comment go unanswered. Late one night, he posted a message mocking both James and Lemon, questioning their intelligence in a way that many people at the time saw as carrying uncomfortable racial undertones, given that both men being targeted were black. The backlash was immediate and significant. Plenty of prominent voices in sports and beyond spoke up in support of James, including, notably, Michael Jordan himself, who released a statement at the time defending James and praising the work he had been doing for his community back in Akron, Ohio, the city where James was born and raised. There's an interesting detail buried in that moment too, one that often gets left out of the retelling. Even First Lady Melania Trump distanced herself slightly from her husband's comments at the time, with her office indicating she supported James's charitable work and would even be open to visiting the school he had built for underprivileged children back home in Akron. So by the time we arrive at 2026, this wasn't some brand new feud springing up out of nowhere. This was chapter 3, or maybe chapter 4, of a rivalry that had already been simmering for nearly 10 years. And running underneath almost the entire thing was one consistent thread. LeBron James had never hidden his political leanings, publicly endorsing Democratic candidates in 3 consecutive presidential elections, supporting Hillary Clinton, then Joe Biden, then later Kamala Harris, each time Trump appeared on the ballot opposing them. For a president who has openly said he tends to like people who like him back, LeBron's very public, very consistent opposition across a decade clearly hadn't been forgotten. That helps explain, at least in part, why Trump's answer to a simple basketball question veered so quickly into something much more personal and much more politically charged. It wasn't really about jump shots or championship rings at all. It was about a relationship between 2 of the most famous men in America that had been openly adversarial for the better part of 10 years. Now, this wasn't even the only NBA-related headline involving Trump from earlier that same year, and it's worth understanding the broader context, because it shows this wasn't an isolated, one-off comment either. Back in June of 2026, just weeks before the LeBron and Jordan comment, Trump had made history by becoming the first sitting United States president to attend an NBA Finals game in person. He showed up at Madison Square Garden in New York City for Game 3 between the New York Knicks and the San Antonio Spurs, arriving with heavy security, alongside family members and members of his administration. The atmosphere around that visit was tense from the very start. Security requirements around the president's attendance were so significant that an official watch party planned outside the arena had to be canceled entirely, and fans attending the game were reportedly put through additional screening and asked to arrive hours earlier than usual just to get inside. And then, during the pre-game national anthem, when Trump's face appeared on the giant screens inside the arena, the crowd's reaction was unmistakable. Loud boos rang out across Madison Square Garden, audible enough that video of the moment spread rapidly across social media within minutes. There were some scattered cheers mixed in too, along with a few chants of USA, but by most accounts, the boos were the dominant sound in the building that night. The Knicks ended up losing that game to the Spurs, falling behind in the series. And in the aftermath, sports commentator Stephen A. Smith, who had publicly stated before the game that he would personally hold Trump's attendance responsible if the Knicks lost, doubled down on that criticism once the final buzzer sounded. Reporters caught up with Trump afterward and asked him directly about being booed. His response followed a familiar pattern for him. He downplayed the negative reaction entirely, insisting that what he'd actually heard from the crowd was mostly enthusiastic cheering rather than jeers. But then, when asked specifically about Stephen A. Smith's criticism, and about Smith's long-rumored ambitions of possibly running for president himself one day, Trump didn't hold back. He said that while he considered Smith a nice enough guy, he questioned whether Smith had the intelligence needed to actually run the country, specifically suggesting his IQ might not be high enough for the job. Stephen A. Smith didn't let that comment slide either. The very next morning, on his widely watched ESPN show First Take, he delivered a fiery response, directly challenging Trump to compare their intelligence levels head-to-head, and pointing out that Trump had seemingly been avoiding a direct one-on-one conversation with him for well over a year at that point. Smith also stuck firmly to his original argument, insisting that the security and disruption caused by a sitting president's attendance had genuinely thrown off the energy and momentum surrounding the Knicks' home game. A couple of days later, Smith addressed the whole exchange again, striking a slightly more measured tone. He said he wasn't personally offended by Trump firing back at him, acknowledging that the president had every right to respond to criticism directed his way. But he also made clear he wasn't backing down from his core point, that a sitting president bringing that level of security and disruption to a finals game was bound to affect the atmosphere for everyone else trying to enjoy it. So when Trump made his comment about LeBron James just a few weeks later, in July, it landed inside a much bigger, already ongoing storyline. Trump had already had one very public, very heavily covered dust-up with a prominent black sports commentator over intelligence and aptitude just weeks earlier. Now here he was again, this time floating an accusation of racism against the league's most recognizable superstar, seemingly out of nowhere, triggered by nothing more than a straightforward question about a GOAT debate. Predictably, the reaction to Trump's comment about LeBron spread across the media landscape within hours. Pointing out that Trump offered no actual example or evidence to support the claim, and noting that questioning someone's character with an unsupported accusation like that carries real weight, especially when it comes from the office of the presidency. Others focused more on the political rivalry angle, framing it as simply the latest chapter in an ongoing, deeply personal disagreement between two men who have clearly never seen eye to eye, and probably never will. It's worth pointing out, too, that LeBron James himself has never publicly stated any personal animosity toward Trump rooted in anything other than policy and political disagreement. His criticisms over the years have consistently centered on specific actions and statements Trump has made as a public figure and elected official, not on Trump's personal identity or background. That distinction matters quite a bit when you're trying to understand the full context here, because it's one thing to disagree sharply with the president's policies and rhetoric, and it's an entirely different thing to be personally accused of racism with no specific incident cited as the reason why. Major outlets across the political spectrum covered the remark, often placing it directly alongside the historical context of Trump and James's years-long public feud. Some commentary framed the accusation as baseless and inflammatory. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan, the man effectively being held up in this whole exchange as the preferred choice, said absolutely nothing publicly about being used this way in the comparison. That silence is, in its own way, completely consistent with everything Jordan has stood for throughout his entire career. He built an entire global brand, one of the most successful athlete partnerships in history, by carefully avoiding exactly this kind of political entanglement. Even when he did speak up for LeBron James back in 2018, defending him against Trump's earlier comments, Jordan kept his statement narrowly focused on praising James's charitable work rather than wading into any broader political argument about Trump himself. Now, let's step back and think about why a moment like this actually matters, beyond just being another headline that will eventually fade from the news cycle. Sports and politics have never been as separate as some people like to imagine. Athletes have used their massive platforms to speak on social and political issues for generations, going all the way back to Muhammad Ali refusing to be drafted into the Vietnam War, to Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fists on the Olympic podium in 1968, to Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem decades later. LeBron James simply represents the most recent, most visible chapter in that same long tradition, a global superstar using his enormous reach to speak openly about political issues he cares about, fully aware that doing so will inevitably invite pushback from people who disagree with him. And presidents, for their part, have often had complicated relationships with outspoken athletes too. It's rare for a sitting president to get into this kind of direct, personal back and forth with a professional athlete, especially one as famous and as beloved globally as LeBron James. But Trump has never been a conventional president when it comes to engaging directly, publicly, and often combatively with public figures who criticize him, whether they're journalists, celebrities, political rivals, or in this case, one of the most famous basketball players who has ever lived. There's also something worth noting about the specific framing Trump used in his answer that day. By saying he simply likes people who like him back, he was, in a strange way, being remarkably transparent about how he approaches these kinds of public rivalries. It wasn't really presented as an argument about basketball greatness rooted in championships or statistics. It was presented as a measure of personal loyalty, filtered entirely through the lens of who has been friendly toward him and who has been critical of him. That's a genuinely unusual way to settle a sports debate that, for most fans, has absolutely nothing to do with politics at all. Millions of people argue about LeBron versus Jordan every single day without a single thought about presidential politics entering the conversation. They argue about clutch shooting, about defensive versatility, about longevity, about who was better in the finals, about eras and rule changes and supporting casts. Trump's answer sidestepped basically all of that entirely, turning a beloved, decades-old basketball argument into something else altogether, a referendum on personal political loyalty. Whether you think that says something revealing about how Trump approaches nearly every public relationship in his life, or whether you see it as simply an offhand, in-the-moment comment that shouldn't be read into too deeply, it undeniably added yet another chapter to one of the more unusual ongoing storylines connecting modern American politics and professional sports. As for LeBron James himself, he didn't immediately respond publicly to Trump's specific comment about the possibility of him being racist. Given his history, it wouldn't be surprising if he eventually addressed it in his own way, on his own platform, in his own time, the same way he has responded to nearly every previous political flashpoint involving Trump over the better part of the last decade. But in the days immediately following the comment, James's public attention remained focused primarily on his historic move to Philadelphia, on introducing himself to a brand new fan base, and on preparing for what he has repeatedly called the final chapter of his remarkable playing career. And Michael Jordan, true to form, simply let the comment pass without any public response at all, continuing the same careful, deliberately apolitical posture that has defined his entire public life since the very beginning of his career, decades earlier. So here's where this story actually leaves us. A simple, light-hearted question about basketball greatness, the kind sports fans debate constantly without a second thought, ended up reopening one of the more complicated, deeply personal rivalries in modern American public life. It's a reminder that in a country as politically divided as the United States has become, even the most beloved and seemingly apolitical topics, like arguing over who's the greatest basketball player of all time, can suddenly become entangled with something far bigger, far more personal, and far more complicated than championships and statistics ever could be. Two of the most famous athletes in the history of American sports, forever linked by this same tired debate that never seems to go away. One of them has spent his entire career carefully avoiding political controversy at almost any cost. The other has spent years openly, unapologetically speaking his mind about the political figures he disagrees with, fully aware of the backlash that decision would inevitably invite. And caught in the middle of it all, a sitting president, weighing in not with statistics or highlight reels, but with a blunt, unprovable accusation that instantly overshadowed whatever original basketball question had even been asked in the first place. Whatever you personally believe about any of the people involved in this story, one thing is clear. In the world we live in now, there's really no such thing as a purely simple sports question anymore, not when the answer comes from the most powerful office in the country, and not when the two men being compared have spent the better part of a decade representing two very different, very public approaches to how far an athlete should go in mixing sports with politics. The basketball world will keep arguing about LeBron versus Jordan for years to come, probably for as long as the sport exists in any recognizable form. Fans will keep bringing up championships, MVPs, iconic finals moments, career longevity, and the different eras each man dominated. That debate isn't going anywhere, and it never really needed politics to make it interesting in the first place. But for one particular Friday in July of 2026, in the middle of one of the biggest basketball headlines of the entire year, that debate briefly became about something else entirely. Not about who scored more points or won more rings, but about a years-long, deeply personal rivalry between a president and a superstar that shows absolutely no signs of quietly fading away anytime soon. Let's take a step back and actually dig into the basketball side of this debate for a moment, because it's worth remembering just how genuinely close and genuinely fascinating the Jordan versus LeBron argument is, independent of any politics whatsoever. This is, after all, supposedly what the original question was even about. Michael Jordan won 6 championships across 2 separate three-peats with the Chicago Bulls in the 1990s. He never lost in the NBA Finals, going 6 for 6 on the sport's biggest stage. He won 5 Most Valuable Player awards, 6 Finals MVP awards, and is remembered as arguably the most dominant, most competitively ferocious player to ever step onto a basketball court. His shoe brand alone became a cultural phenomenon that transcended basketball entirely, turning him into one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, decades after his final shot as a Chicago Bull. LeBron James, meanwhile, built an entirely different kind of legacy. He has played, at an elite level, across 4 different decades, an almost unthinkable feat of sustained excellence and physical conditioning in a league that is notoriously brutal on the body. He has won 4 championships with 3 different franchises, a level of adaptability across different systems, teammates, and eras that Jordan, playing his entire prime with one organization, never had to demonstrate. He holds the record for the most total points scored in NBA history, a record many people once assumed would never be broken, let alone by a player who was still active and competing well into his 40s. He has also built one of the largest media and business empires ever assembled by an active professional athlete, all while remaining a genuine, undeniable force on the basketball court itself. Basketball historians, former players, and analysts have debated this exact matchup for years without ever reaching any kind of true consensus, and that's precisely what makes it such an enduring topic. Jordan supporters point to his flawless finals record and his unmatched competitive intensity. LeBron supporters point to his statistical dominance, his longevity, and his versatility as a player who can genuinely do everything on a basketball court: score, rebound, pass, and defend, often all in the same game, at an elite level. It's a debate that exists entirely on its own terms, built from decades of highlight reels, playoff battles, and generational shifts in how the game itself is played. It doesn't need presidential politics to make it compelling. And that's exactly why it felt so jarring to so many people watching this particular exchange unfold, seeing a question rooted in pure basketball nostalgia get answered with an accusation that had nothing to do with jump shots or championship banners at all. There's another angle to this story worth exploring too, one that goes beyond the specific comment itself and into the broader pattern of how modern athletes and modern presidents interact with each other in the age of social media. It wasn't always like this. Go back several decades, and it was extremely rare for a sitting president to publicly comment on the personal character of an active professional athlete, let alone accuse one of racism based on nothing more specific than a general sense that the athlete probably doesn't support them politically. Part of that shift traces back to the rise of social media itself, which flattened the distance between the White House and everyday public discourse. Presidents used to communicate primarily through carefully worded official statements, press briefings, and speeches. Today, a president can post a reaction to a basketball game, respond directly to a celebrity's criticism, or answer an offhand question from a reporter in the Oval Office, and within minutes, that comment is being dissected by millions of people across every major news outlet and social media platform simultaneously. Trump, more than any president before him, has leaned into that shift, using direct, informal, often blunt communication as a defining feature of his entire political brand. Whether people view that as refreshingly authentic or recklessly undisciplined tends to depend heavily on which side of the political aisle they're standing on. But there's no denying it has fundamentally changed how moments like this one play out. A basketball question in the Oval Office, once upon a time, might have gotten a brief, polite, forgettable answer. In 2026, it became a viral, multi-day news story, dissected by sports outlets, political outlets, and everything in between. It's also worth examining LeBron James's own relationship with political activism a little more closely, because it helps explain exactly why he has remained such a lightning rod for this kind of attention for so long. Unlike many athletes of his stature who have historically tried to stay neutral in order to protect endorsement deals and broad public appeal, LeBron made a very deliberate choice, years ago, to lean into political and social commentary rather than avoid it. He founded the I Promise School in his hometown of Akron, Ohio, an institution built specifically to support underprivileged children and their families, offering resources far beyond just a traditional classroom education, including support services for parents as well. He has spoken out repeatedly on issues of racial justice, voting rights, and police violence throughout his career, often facing significant criticism for doing so, particularly from commentators who argue that athletes should simply stick to sports and leave political commentary to others. James has consistently rejected that argument, publicly stating on multiple occasions that his platform gives him both the opportunity and, in his view, the responsibility to speak out on issues he considers important, regardless of any backlash that might follow. That philosophy has made him deeply beloved by many, and deeply controversial to others, precisely the kind of polarizing combination that makes him such a frequent target for criticism from political figures like Trump, who has built much of his own public persona around directly confronting people who criticize him. Consider, too, just how unusual it is for a debate about sports greatness to even reach the Oval Office in the first place. Peter Doocy, the reporter who asked the original question, works for Fox News, a network with a large, politically engaged audience that skews heavily toward Trump's base of support. It's worth wondering whether the question was asked purely out of genuine sports curiosity, or with some awareness that Trump's answer, whatever it turned out to be, was likely to generate significant news coverage regardless of which player he ultimately picked. Either way, the answer Trump gave ended up overshadowing the basketball question almost entirely. Within hours, headlines across major outlets weren't focused on Jordan's 6 championships or LeBron's scoring record. They were focused entirely on the specific phrase Trump had used, wondering aloud whether one of the most famous athletes on the planet might be racist, seemingly rooted in nothing more concrete than a decade of political disagreement. That's ultimately the strange irony sitting at the center of this entire story. A question designed to spark a fun, nostalgic sports debate ended up producing a headline almost entirely disconnected from basketball itself. Fans looking for insight into how Trump viewed the two players' on-court legacies got almost nothing on that front. What they got instead was a window into a much older, much more personal conflict, one rooted in politics, perceived loyalty, and years of mutual public criticism that has clearly never been fully resolved. Looking ahead, it seems unlikely this will be the last time these two very different, very public figures find themselves connected in a headline together. LeBron James is embarking on what he has called his final NBA chapter, playing for a franchise and a city desperate for a championship it hasn't celebrated in over 4 decades. That alone guarantees continued national media attention throughout the coming season, coverage that will almost certainly include occasional questions about his political views, his outspoken history, and yes, probably his complicated, years-long relationship with Donald Trump as well. And Trump, for his part, has shown no indication of stepping back from public commentary on athletes, entertainers, or public figures who criticize him, regardless of the medium or the setting in which those comments arise, whether that's a press conference, a late-night social media post, or an offhand answer to a reporter's question about basketball nostalgia inside the Oval Office. So for now, the story simply is what it is. A basketball question. An unexpected answer. A decade-old rivalry resurfacing in the middle of one of the biggest roster moves in recent NBA history. And two of the most famous men in the world, once again finding themselves at the center of a national conversation that started with a simple question about who's the greatest of all time, and ended up being about almost everything except that.